I have a confession to make. So last week I bought a hair clip with a butterfly on it, and I don't even use hair clips. I just bought it because it had a butterfly on it. And I realized after coming home, as expected, I did not end up using it. I just ended up putting on my nightstand and let it sit there because I realized it was just nice to have a butterfly on my nightstand. And I've been thinking about why it almost feels rebellious to admit that. There's this thing that happens when you become an adult, or maybe more accurately, when you start performing adulthood, where you develop an acute sensitivity to being perceived as immature. That results in us altering our personality that almost seems unreasonable. It looks like turning the entire wardrobe into a boring beige and a bunch of neutrals that you don't even connect to. You stop buying butterfly clips. And for someone like me, every single hobby I've had as a practice or as a side hustle. Drinking matcha has been extremely cool and adult, even though you don't just like the taste of matcha. And I think most people recognize this pattern and just roll their eyes at it. Yes, we've all seen the tweets. And adulthood is a trap. But I actually want to dig into why whimsy gets policed so hard by culture, because I think it's just more interesting than the fact that society is just boring. The word whimsical is actually really fascinating to me because it has this sense of dual reputation. On one hand, it's used as a compliment, quirky, imaginative, and delightful. And on the other hand, it's just a small wave of calling someone not so serious in life. Oh, it's a little whimsical, is what people say about a business that is going to fail, or a person they find charming but they don't actually respect. There's actually a reason behind why we don't call surgeons whimsical. And we don't want our lawyers to be whimsical either. Whimsical is fine over there in arts, in the children's content, in the aesthetic corner of the internet, where everyone has fairy lights and mushroom lamps. But it's not supposed to bleed into the serious parts of the life. And I find it really interesting because historically, that really wasn't the case. If you look at the medieval illuminated manuscripts, and these are serious religious documents, they're filled with marginalia of knights fighting snails, like giant snails, fully armored combat between men and snails. And nobody knows exactly why. But the point is that the monks who were making these texts, which were considered sacred, also thought it was okay to draw a little snail in the corner of a book. Or look at Rococo, this entire aristocratic art movement. That was basically just, what if everything was just curlier? Versailles has a room from floor to ceiling that is just gold leaf and painted clouds. And that signals that someone thought, what if the ceiling was also a party? There is something about the pre-industrial aesthetics where the serious and the playful coexisted more naturally. And the whimsy was part of the function. And then industrialization happens, and suddenly efficiency is the highest value. And the ornamental starts to get coded as wasteful. As we get this very Protestant work ethic idea that decoration is almost morally suspect. You should be able to justify everything you own and do this by its utility. Which brings me to what I think is actually going on when we dismiss whimsy. That it has certainly become more about productivity and legibility. Whimsy is inefficient because a butterfly clip doesn't do anything additional than a plain hair clip would. These are choices made purely because they create a feeling, and feelings, especially pleasant and low-stake feelings, are very hard to justify in a culture where your value is tied with your output. And as we spoke about the legibility thing happening, when someone presents them in a whimsical way, dresses eccentrically, has weird hobbies, and decorates their home unusually, they become harder to read. You can't possibly file them into a category immediately. And people find that slightly uncomfortable, as if there's a social contract where we all agree to be a little legible to each other, and whimsy breaks that contract. But here's what's funny, and by funny I mean bleak. We simultaneously fetishize whimsy as a brand. Think about all these companies that market themselves as playful or fun. Think about how much of Instagram is just dedicated to aesthetically charming, whimsical places like the coffee shop with the dried flowers, the bookstore with the cat, and the restaurant that puts tiny herbs on everything. And this is because we want to consume whimsy and we want whimsy in everything. There's this gap between appreciating charm in others and allowing charm within yourself. Because when it's someone else's, it's entertainment. But when it's you, it's perceived as a liability. I think about this a lot in the context of how women relate to whimsy. Because on one hand, there's this whole aesthetic universe, cottagecore, balletcore, the whole soft life thing. That's basically whimsy packaged as being feminine. And it's genuinely beautiful, and I don't want to be dismissive of it. But there's also this weird double bind where women who connect with being whimsical do not get taken seriously in professional contexts. And so you end up with this very calculated, performative whimsy. It's allowed in your home, in your personal style when you go out on weekends, in your even curated online presence, but you code switch when you're at work and you put away the butterfly. And men have this version too, it's just framed differently. A grown man who, let's say, is into model trains or cries when he watches animated movies or has a deeply silly sense of humor. There's a whole discourse around whether that's endearing or immature. The people who get celebrated for being whimsical men are either very rich and powerful, so they can afford the eccentricity, or they're artists, which explains their creative personality. The rest of us are just managing it. But I don't want to make this video about how the society is repressive, because I also think there's something genuinely worth defending here. I think whimsy is actually also a survival skill. More specifically in the sense, to have the capacity to find something delightful for no rational reason is a form of resistance against a culture that wants every experience you have to be productive. The butterfly clip is useless, and that is the point of the butterfly clip. There's a concept in Japanese called mono no aware, roughly translated as bittersweet awareness of impermanence. It is the appreciation of things precisely because they are small and fleeting and don't mean anything in the grand scheme. And I think whimsy operates on a frequency similar to that. It's finding meaning in something unmeaningful. It's refusing to require everything that just happens to justify itself. And I actually think people who are good at whimsy, who genuinely take delight in the small, silly, decorative, non-useful things, tend to be a little more resilient than the rest of us because they've developed a relationship with pleasure that does not depend on achievement, and they in turn know how to be okay before they reach a goal. I don't think the solution here is to become whimsical aggressively as a brand for your personality. That is also just another performance. And I also don't think that every adult in their sad beige apartment needs to buy another mushroom lamp. But I do think it's worth noticing where you're altering your personality and when you're about to buy the butterfly clip and you end up putting it back in the store. And realizing why behind this, because someone might think it's silly, someone might, and it is a butterfly. And butterflies are a very specific choice to have. And being allowed to think that you're overly specific around certain choices does not mean anything around your intelligence or your seriousness or your worth as a person. This, I would argue, is kind of what the whole project is about, with you and your personality and identity. And I hope you end up finding your butterflies too. Okay, that's it for today. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. I put in a lot of efforts for you guys, and drop in a comment below about what your whimsy is. I would love to know, and see you in the next video.